Hello, members, and those listening on the podcast. So, Mary Bateman had basically said she was with child. Now, under English common law, pleading the belly permitted women in the later stages of pregnancy to be reprieved of their death sentence until after the delivery of the child. The plea did not constitute a defence and could only be made after a guilty verdict had been pleaded. Then there would be verification of the claimant's condition that would be determined by jury of matrons, and they would be drawn up from women observing the proceedings in the courtroom. Now, what it means is, if they were found to be quick with child, that is, there had to be movements of a fetus that could be determined, a reprieve would be granted until after the birth, and obviously the sentence of execution was reinstated and enacted. The date set around the hangings at the time, but would be after they actually had the child. Some fortunate women awarded such a reprieve would even subsequently be granted pardons or have their sentences commuted to transportation of imprisonment. In spite of the perceived increase in levels of crime, the late 18th century witnessed the developments of non-capital punishments, such as transportation and imprisonment as an alternative sentence for certain crimes. And needless to say, consequently, the system was open to abuse. In Daniel Defoe's novel, Moll Flanders, written in 1721, one character successfully pleads her belly despite being no more with child than the judge that tried her. And the practice of selecting a jury of matrons from the courtroom observers opened up the opportunity for planting sympathetic accomplices in the public gallery, causing one 18th century commentator to complain that female felons would have matrons of their own profession ready at hand, who, right or wrong, bring their wicked companions quick with child in the great impediment of justice. Well, of course, such examinations could not have detected the condition of those who had recently conceived. In theory, very early stages of pregnancy prior to the fetus quickening, which means the fetus being felt, moved, it was moving about, they did not qualify for a stay of execution. There had been an earlier example in this, the execution of Christian Murphy on the 18th of March 1789 at Newgate for counterfeiting silver coins. Though she had pleaded her belly, the matrons who examined her concluded that she was not quick with child, meaning she wasn't in a late trimester, but she was with child, but it was just earlier on, only for a short time. Her execution went ahead nevertheless. Christian Murphy was the last woman in England to be strangled and burned at the stake, the crime of coining classed as petty treason. So they killed her and her unborn child. How nice is that? In an attempt to limit the abuse of the system further, the law decreed that no woman could be granted a second reprieve on an original sentence passed if she was later found to be with child, even if they were actually pregnant. While the gaoler or local sheriff in charge of any female prisoner falling pregnant held in their custody was subject to a fine, this threat did not always present an effective deterrent, however, as the case of Mary Bergen shows. Originally convicted in 1705 of killing her first baby, for which she would ordinarily have been hanged, while awaiting trial at York, Bergen became pregnant again, in all probability by a man there, Thomas Ward, actually. And Mary was allowed to live in the prison with a son. Thomas, who grew up in York Castle, Gaol, supported by payments made by the three ridings until 1718, when he was put out to apprenticeship at the age of 12. Mary had been listed as a reprieve in the calendar of felons for York Castle 1707, a sentence subsequently commuted to that of transportation, but it appears she was eventually released under a general pardon issued by Queen Anne in 1710. The power of pardon being a royal prerogative, of mercy in the gift of the monarch of the United Kingdom, most frequently cited in cases where the death penalty had been given. As for Turnkey Ward, clearly not all the criminals were behind bars. Hence, how did she get pregnant? Responsible for the daily running of the gaol, Ward exploited his position, charging a fee for showing visitors round the cells. He was a bully, an extortionist, and forced prisoners to buy food and drink from him at inflated prices. And matters came to head in 1709 when prisoners signed a petition against his inhumane and unchristian behaviour. And nevertheless, 1718, Ward became the governor of York Castle Gaol. Other women who claimed to be enceinte, with child, were also fortunate enough to escape the noose. Which is interesting because, like I say, it does depend on how far they were. There was Elizabeth Cahill had indulged in a spot of pickpocketing in Leeds Market on New Year's Eve, 1728. After languishing in gaol for some time, she was reprieved on successfully pleading her belly, and her daughter Anne was baptised in York Castle on the 15th May 1733. Elizabeth's sentence was revised. She was sent as transportation enacted in the summer of 1735. Naomi Hollings had been sentenced to death at the Lent Assizes of 1739 for the theft of money and goods after breaking and entering a private dwelling house. Again, she was reprieved on successfully pleading her belly, and on the 13th of June 1739 her son was christened Castellus in York Castle, an apt name given to the child's place of birth. A sentence was also reinstated after the birth, though again commuted to that of transportation the following summer of 1740. Not every convicted female felon fares so well, however. Despite legitimately pleading her belly, Elizabeth Webster had her sentence reinstated for the poisoning of her husband, and was ultimately executed on the 5th of March 1744, some 5 months after the baptism of her son in York Castle Gaol. There is no record as to what became of the orphaned William Webster, but a prison birth in the 18th century was in all probability not the most auspicious of beginnings for a child. Some were lucky enough to receive support for their upkeep from the 3 ridings until old enough to be put out to an apprenticeship, usually around 12 years of age, as was the case with Turnkey Ward's progeny. What was the outcome in Mary's case? To verify a plea, Judge LeBlanc ordered the sheriffs to accompany a jury of matrons from the courtroom, 12 married women who would be asked to ascertain whether or not Mary was indeed pregnant. This order created a general consternation among the ladies, who hastened to quit the court to prevent the execution of so painful an office being imposed upon them. But anticipating this reaction, the judge ordered the doors of the courtroom be locked, lest the jury of empanelled matrons tried to escape their duty. In about half an hour, 12 married women had been sworn in and charged to inquire whether the prisoner was quick with child. Mary was escorted to another room where, after intimate examination, the 12 women eventually pronounced that her claim was unfounded. Even if Mary's plea had been verified, it's unlikely that in the view of the high profile of her case she would have been granted any reprieve other than that of delaying the inevitable. Mary was remanded back to prison, pregnant or not. The records of Mary's last days in prison confirm that she was allowed to have her youngest child with her in the condemned cell until her removal for execution. At the time, it was common practice for a woman's children to accompany their mother in prison, especially in the case of infants, classed as care-dependent of a nursing mother. Such children often remained in the cell with their mothers until they were executed, clinging on for dear life as their parent was led away in the gallows. While the sex of the child that shared Mary's cell is not stipulated. In all likelihood it was a son, James Bateman, who was incarcerated along with his mother. The parish records of St. Peter's, Leeds, showing his date of baptism on the 19th of July 1807. After a trial, it was noted that as soon as Mary was returned to her cell, she took her infant child and gave it breast, a circumstance which considerably affected the gaoler who attended her on this melancholy occasion. Over the course of the intervening weekend, between her receiving sentence of death and her appointed execution, the ordinary or prison chaplain, the Reverend George Brown, was at great pains to prevail on Mary that she acknowledge and confess to her crimes before her date with the gallows. Had it been forthcoming, as well as assuaging the threat to her mortal soul, Mary's confession would have provided legitimacy to the court's decision and justification for hanging, as well as material for sensationalized public consumption, as such confessions were often published and devoured by a populace hungry for the sorrowful repentance of those who had formerly pleaded their innocence. Exemplified by the popularity of broadsheets, these confessions were published as public accounts, and in turn proved a significant contribution to bolstering the legitimacy of the justice system. Mary's refusal to make any admission of her guilt was the exception rather than the rule, however, as the majority of convicted murderers, regardless of the gender, played their role in their propagation of public justice by admitting to the horror of their crimes after condemnation. So, in the justice of fates, really. Nevertheless, Mary held fast, and the Reverend Brown's mention of the deaths of the Quaker Kitchen sisters and their mother back in September 1803, Mary said she would not be pressed on the subject, as at the time she had been confined in childbirth. Using the baptismal records of St. Peter's Church from 1804, Mary can only have been in the early stages of pregnancy, if indeed she was pregnant at the time. In spite of her circumstances, observers noted that Mary continued to behave in a decorous manner. She joined in with the customary offices of devotion, but she showed no sign of remorse or repentance, maintained a caution and mystery to the last. On Sunday, the day before her execution, Mary wrote a letter to her husband, who had not visited his wife since the guilty verdict had been pronounced. With this letter she enclosed her wedding ring and asked him to give it to the daughter. While she lamented the disgrace she had brought upon John and the family, and admitted being guilty of some frauds, my italics, she nevertheless maintained her innocence and continued to deny her involvement in Rebecca Perigo's death. Mary also wrote in the letter that she had made her peace with God. As this was Mary's last letter, and the only one in her own words, the transcription is full, as it appeared in Reed's York Castle in the 19th century, is perhaps warranted. And the letter is this, because I have the letter here, guys. My dear husband, I do send you here with my ring that I had of you when I was more happy, and had not disgraced you. You must give it to my dear girl, who will keep it forever in remembrance of a poor unhappy mother. Though you are disgraced by me, I trust in Christ you will forgive me, as I am sorry, and hope to be forgiven. I am innocent of murder. I did get money at many times, but that was all. I did never destroy that woman for whom I am to suffer. I am innocent of that, though I did many things else, for which I am much aggrieved. I have made my peace with God, and am easy in mind. The worst is when I will part my blessed baby. God bless you, forgive your poor wife, who is only in affection for you. Tomorrow will end all here, and the Lord will care for me hereafter. Your loving and sorrowful wife, Mary Bateman. Yet in spite of her outward show of contrition, it was later reported to the Leeds Intelligence, a newspaper, that Mary continued her criminal habits, even from a condemned cell, telling the fortune of one of her female attendants for the price of a guinea, and incredibly, even during her final few hours, Mary found time to commit one last fraud. Perhaps resigned to her fate, she thought she had nothing to lose. With her usual cunning, she convinced her fellow prisoner. If she could somehow get hold of a specified sum of money by allowing Mary to stitch the coins into her stays, the contemporary term for a corset, this charm would somehow bring her sweetheart to visit her in prison. But when the lover's promised visit failed to materialize, the girl tore open the valise and discovered that the coins had mysteriously vanished. Mary protested her innocence to the accusation of this theft. With the same conviction she applied to a denial of having any part of the death of Rebecca Perigo. The Reverend Brown again visited Mary on Sunday evening, but in spite of his exhortations to confess her sins on the eve of her execution, Mary resolutely maintained a denial of the crime for which she was to be hanged the following morning. At 5 a.m. on Monday the 20th of March, Mary was awoken and removed from her cell to attend communion service in prison chapel, and while this afforded her a further opportunity to unburden herself with a confession, no admissions were forthcoming. Mary kissed her youngest child, still asleep on the bed in the condemned cell, for the last time, before being led away to the gallows, the preparations of which must have been clearly audible. The scaffold was almost certainly permanently erected, but the ropes had to be tried and tested, and this was not a silent operation. It must have been an eerie experience for those shortly to die as they heard the crush of the drop and the creak of the rope. Mary was to be hanged on York's New Drop. The executions, formally carried out at Knavesmere upon the York Tyburn, or three-legged mare, as it was known, having ceased in 1801. The former gallows, which overlooked the racecourse, had been a cleverly designed tripod arrangement that, in name and structure, echoed its London counterpart, the Tyburn Tree, a triple gallows configuration allowing multiple hangings on the same day. Although the public spectacle of execution was supposed to act as a deterrent to the populace, and making them afraid and fearful of falling victim to the same fate, this was not always the case, and amongst those laughing and joking about the awful sight they were about to witness, there would inevitably be pickpockets and robbers exploiting the opportunity to work the crowd, literally in the shadow of the gallows. To quote Dr. Johnson's opinion of public execution, if they do not draw spectators, they do not answer their purpose. But he had clearly missed the whole point. Public hangings often took place as mass entertainment quality, perhaps akin to an open-air concert atmosphere today. Human nature being what it is, these events turned out to be perversely enjoyable, distraction from a routine grind of everyday life, food and drink on sale, souvenirs being hauled. Crowds, including families with young children, would bring along a picnic and make a day of it. And despite the obvious taste and enthusiasm for the spectacle of the public execution, the ultimate decision to move the proceedings to York Castle Gaol was heavily influenced by the objectionable initial impression of the city given by the Knavesmere gallows, located as they were next to one of the main highways into York. On execution day, the sight of the gallows were also a cause of major road congestion, a parallel, perhaps, between the traffic jams resulting from the ghoulish curiosity at the sight of an accident today, the gathering crowd, impending traffic flow. In an article printed on the 25th of July 1800, the York Herald explained, "This will be removed from one of the principal roads leading to the city, that disagreeable nuisance, the gallows, and thus will the inhabitants and passengers be no longer interrupted and their humanity hurt by the leading of unfortunate people to the place of execution." As a consequence, in order that the entrance into town should no longer be annoyed by dragging criminals through the streets at the civic meeting, it was decided that investment in a new gallows should be made, the cost of which totalled £10 and 15 shillings. The New Drop, as it became known, constructed by Joseph Halfpenny, joiner of Blake Street in the city, was set up at the back of the castle in an area bounded by the Castle Mills Bridge and the River Ouse, roughly where the roundabout by St George's car park is today. Looking toward York Castle Museum, still discernible in the wall on the right, is a small doorway through which the condemned prisoners were led, a far shorter and less disruptive route than the one formerly taken in open cart, the condemned sitting on their coffin, already wearing their shroud, jolted on through Micklegate, bar towards the Knavesmere for their execution. Though sensibility had won the day, the first execution on New Drop having taken place in 1802, the Knavesmere gallows stood, albeit unused, for a further 10 years, before being finally dismantled in 1812. We can only speculate to why the execution of certain criminals drew more of a crowd than others. Sometimes the notoriety of the crime committed affected the draw. Dick Turpin is a case in point, or even the weather might limit numbers. Special note was always made of any execution where the strength of the crowd was considered to be great, usually referred to in the records as a large concourse of spectators, sometimes even resulting in injury to the assembled onlookers. 1649, the hanging at York of a convicted husband and wife, George and Maria Merrington, proved so great an attraction that the day ended with broken bones. In Mary's case, the crowd was variously estimated to be between 5 and 20,000. She was not alone on the gallows that Monday morning, as she was hanged in company with a fellow prisoner, Joseph Brown, an agriculture labourer also convicted at the 1809 Lent Assizes for the murder of his 55-year-old landlady, Elizabeth Fletcher of Hansel, near Ferry Bridge, and the attempted murder of her sister Sarah in 1804. Though suspected at the time of Elizabeth Fletcher's death, Brown escaped justice as there was insufficient proof that he had liberally laced the Fletcher sisters' sweetened ale with an overdose of laudanum. Brown, like Mary, was also widely regarded as possessing some mystical powers, the basis of which was his ability to predict the death of others. Whether or not he foretold his own demise, he was certainly the cause of it, as having later been convicted of theft and sentenced to transportation while awaiting embarkation for Botany Bay, he confessed to his earlier crimes. The surviving Fletcher sister giving damning evidence against him at his retrial. Officiating on the gallows on the morning of the 20th was York's most famous hangman, the twice sentenced, twice reprieved William Mutton Curry. In York, the position of hangman was usually filled by a convicted felon who had been pardoned sentence of death on the condition that he accept the job, some of whom even took on something of a dubious celebrity status. A convicted sheep stealer, hence his ovine nickname, Mutton. Curry was originally a labourer from Thirsk. His sentence of death had been twice commuted to transportation, and while being held in York Castle Gaol in 1802, awaiting his enforced passage to Australia, he was prevailed upon to accept the vacant position of hangman. Curry was known to be partial to a drop of gin, perhaps hardly surprising, given the nature of his work. This consequently led to some less than professional executions. On one occasion, Curry was so drunk, the Times reported that the execution, in a bungling manner and with great difficulty, being in the state of intoxication, placed the cap over the culprit's face and attempted several times to place a rope around his neck, but was unable. It took the assistance of Gowler and the sheriff's officers to complete the job, before an incensed and increasingly hostile crowd angrily demanded Curry's own execution. On another occasion, clearly the worse for drink, Curry accidentally and actually ended up falling through the trapdoor himself. He would go on to hang 14 Luddites, machine wreckers, one day in January 1813, did not actually retire until 1835. As the time for execution approached, both prisoners proceeded to the gallows, accompanied by the sheriff and his attendants. It was noted that the number of persons assembled was much greater than usual for such occasion, and many of those turning out to see Mary swing, having come to a great distance to witness the spectacle, and a large number travelling from Leeds on foot, straggling along the course of today's A64, still linking Leeds to York. One wonder how many of their number were made up of those who swindled by the Yorkshire witch. Nevertheless, the appearance of Mary upon the gallows created a visible emotion among the spectators, and not a brutal insult, as one once disgraced the British character in the metropolis, but of awe and deep commiseration. A hushed and respectful silence fell over the assembled crowd during the few moments the prisoners spent in prayer, only interrupted by a half-suppressed cry for mercy. The Reverend Brown made only one last attempt at persuading Mary to relieve her conscience and unburden her soul before the drop fell, inquiring whether she had any communication to make. Mary said she was innocent. It was reported that some of the spectators gathered that morning really thought that Mary would save herself from death at the last moment by employing her supernatural powers to vanish into thin air as the noose tightened. But when the drop fell, Mary's life ended, along with that of Joseph Brown, both sent to face another more awful tribunal in the great hereafter. After execution by hanging, it was usual for the body to be left dangling for about half an hour before being cut down and ordinarily claimed by friends or relatives for burial. A skilled hangman's knot would ensure the certainty of a broken neck, usually at the third vertebrae below the skull, and therefore a swift end. But the alternative was a slow and agonizing death by strangulation, the sinister origin of the phrase "to pull one's leg," and the expression "hangers on," and harking back to the time when criminals' families would pay someone to pull down on them during their hanging. That's where it actually comes from. However, that part of Mary's sentence stipulating that your body be given to the surgeons to be dissected and atomized was now carried out. Mary Bateman's body was loaded onto a horse-drawn cart to be taken to Leeds General Infirmary. Yet, with the road from York to Leeds thronged with horses and pigs, and those who had come on foot to see the execution, it was close on midnight before the hearse reached its destination. Even at this late hour it was met by immense crowds of persons curious to view Mary's lifeless body. Such was the macabre demand for a look at the deceased murderess that on the following day Mary's corpse was exhibited in the surgeon's room at the infirmary, with 3p admission charge for the privilege. Incredibly, the number of people willing to pay exceeded 2,500, many of them touching the body before they left the room, a superstitious precaution against the belief that Mary might interfere with their dreams. Consequently, the sum of £30 was raised for the benefit of General Infirmary. At least, Mary had performed one genuine charitable deed, even if it were from beyond the grave, though of course she was never actually buried. Mary's dissection was an event doubtless attended by some who were not aspiring physicians. During the 19th century, the spectacle of dissection was quite available to members of the public. They might be patrons, artists, or even ticket-buying curiosity seekers who had paid a high price, certainly in this instance. What is surprising is that Madame Tussaud does not seem to have been interested in capturing Mary's likeness in wax for a separate room, as the Chamber of Horrors was then known. It may be she missed the boat, quite literally, because her touring show was in Dublin during the trial, and she moved it to Belfast in May. Pauline Chapman, in Madame Tussaud's Chamber of Horrors, gets Mary's name wrong, calling her Mary Bates, and often no explanation as to why she was not included in the list of ghoulish exhibits. It would be another 12 years before there were any new additions. After the dissections were complete, the greater part of Mary's skin was removed, tanned and preserved. The strips of the resulting leather sold as lucky charms and curios. To modern eyes, though, this undoubtedly appears to have been a grisly practice. Mary Bateman, seemingly one of the earliest murderers to have her skin thus preserved, she was certainly not the last. The skin of William Burke, the murderer of Daft Jamie in the Netherbow district of Edinburgh, the skin of William Corder, who killed Maria Martin in the Red Barn. Both appeared in later years as book covers and calling card cases. Mary Bateman's skin, tanned and distributed in small places to different applicants according to the January 1873 edition of Notes and Queries, ended up spread all over Yorkshire. Among those who possessed such a gruesome keepsake was William Elmhurst, a deputy lieutenant from the West Riding, and though it seems improbable that a man in such an upright position, and renowned for his enmity, dull character would relish a portion of a murderess, he was a friend of Mr. Chorley's, one of the officiating surgeons at the Leeds Infirmary, and the same surgeon who had looked after William Perigo, and who had provided the analysis of Mary's poisons at her trial. Indeed, a folding cup made of Mary's skin certainly belonged to the Helmer's son, Robert, at one time. The gruesome fascination didn't end there, however, as other portions of Mary's skin were employed to cover books. The Prince of Wales, the future George the Sixth. Was it the sixth or was it the fourth? Allegedly owned a volume bound in her skin. It was George the Fourth, I think. Shelved in his library at Marlborough House. Yeah, George the Fourth. And other similarity-bound tomes were once held in the library of Methley Hall in Yorkshire, though since the house was demolished in 1963, the whereabouts are now unknown. With regards to the fate of the rest of Mary's mortal remains, a monster 1867 catalogue of curiosities listed in Mr. Stubbs' private museum in Ripon, North Yorkshire, appears an entry for a part of the tongue of Mary Bateman, the notorious Yorkshire witch. Obviously the macabre memento had later passed into another's hands, as in 1891 the editor of Yorkshire Notes and Queries wrote that the tongue of Mary Bateman is in the possession of a gentleman in Ilkley, with whom we are personally acquainted. There is absolutely no doubt as to its genuineness. The curious reader may see it any time by the courtesy of the present owner. In fact, Mary's pickled tongue was still on a list of these items held by Bollinghall Museum in Bradford, 1950s. However, as the exhibit was deemed to be too macabre to be held in museum's collection, it was destroyed by incineration. As for Mary's skeleton, this was used initially for autopsy classes, and afterwards, together with plaster casts, death masks of her face, put on display in the Leeds Medical School. Here, the dismembered skeleton remained for nearly 200 years, before being loaned to the Thackeray Medical Museum in Leeds, along with the death mask, where, minus the legs, and without the mandible, but bizarrely with the apparent additional rib, it was an exhibit which until very recently could still be viewed by the public. There is perhaps an echo here of Lord Justice Clerk Boyle officiating at William Burke's trial in December 1829, and summoning up his sentencing with the words, "And I trust that if it is ever customary to preserve skeletons, yours will be preserved, in order that posterity may keep in remembrance of your atrocious crimes." It was, and is still on display, in the Anatomy Museum of Edinburgh Medical School. A further tangible vestige of Mary Bateman's execution is also still in existence, held in the archives of York Museum Trust. This is an original copy of one of the many broadsheets printed to be hawked to the crowds attending that day, detailing the crimes of Mary Bateman and Joseph Brown. Just like programmes sold today, that's what they were. They were just like programmes, and they were usually sold for like a penny, you know. In instance measuring a little over 15 inches long by 9 inches wide, the Bateman Brown broadsheet was produced in William Story's print shop in Low Pettigate in the city. Story's business was still listed in the second volume of History Directory and Gazette of Yorkshire for 1823. The printing works at number 53 part of a site which had been used as a printing works since before 1768. An adjacent house at number 7, Great Plain, having been acquired in 1819 by William Story as an extension to the works, so clearly Story was still in business over a decade after Mary's execution, though her eventual legacy would prove to be far more enduring. She kind of got the celebrity status, as she was given, as a list of female murderers, she was given the name Yorkshire Witch because it was murder by poison, and that was the whole sort of thing of the villainous woman, you know, murder by poison. And there is no worthy likeness of the Yorkshire Witch, nothing but a rough cut prefixed to the extraordinary life and character of Mary Bateman, which is here reproduced in all its native awareness. So they really did absolutely believe that she was indeed a Yorkshire witch. And, you know, they made a 3D mask of her face. They kept her skin and made things out of her skin, you know. I mean, it's just bizarre, isn't it? The insidious arts practiced by this woman rendered her a pest to the neighbourhood in which she resided, and she richly deserved the fate which eventually befell her. And they're just some of the things that people wrote afterwards, you know. An air of placidity and composure, not ill adapted to make a favourable impression on those who visited her. Her manner of address was soft and insinuating, with the affection of sanctity. In her domestic arrangements she was regular, and was mistress of such qualifications in housewifery as, with an honest art, would have enabled her to fill her situation with respectability and usefulness. Do you see how it's so two-sided? It's very different, isn't it? You have one side, but she still has those people who absolutely believe she was the one and only Yorkshire witch, which is just very interesting to me because, you know, she was a murderer, but regardless of her name being damned, she has everlasting fame. Only time will tell if that continues and continues, but up to now, she still is quite famous. She is the Yorkshire Witch. And that is the end to our Mary Bateman, the Yorkshire Witch, guys. So obviously, we're actually going to move on to, we're going to move on now to the American witchcraft and other countries and such, mainly in America, USA, not over here in England anymore. I also do have some pictures of different things. I think I'm going to put them up for the members only because they're kind of like Mary's Baptist records and, you know, the church where Mary's village were, where she was born. So, and then the Old Market Cross that is out there as well. So, yeah, I'll pop them up probably just for members because obviously I don't want them up there for everybody. Right, thank you so much for listening. I truly appreciate it. And many blessings.